what if I told you that somewhere beneath the mountains of Western China, inside a room that officially does not exist, a conversation may have taken place that could reshape the global balance of power for the next 50 years? And if that conversation happened the way many strategic planners fear it did, then what America is facing today is not just a regional crisis, an oil crisis, or even a military confrontation. It may be the quiet beginning of something much larger, the birth of a new strategic order. Because history does not always announce itself with explosions and headlines. Sometimes it begins with a handshake nobody witnesses, a document nobody leaks, a flight nobody tracks, or a silent decision that changes everything. And if you truly understand what may be unfolding between China and Iran right now, you may understand why some voices in Washington have suddenly become quieter instead of louder. Because the most dangerous weapon in the world is not always the one that flies through the sky. Sometimes it is the one that makes your opponent realize he can no longer move freely. And what we are discussing today is not prophecy or fantasy. It is strategy, incentives, structure, and the repeating patterns that appear whenever powerful empires begin feeling pressure from directions they never expected. For decades, the global system operated on one central belief. No matter how chaotic the world became, no matter what wars erupted or governments collapsed, the United States remained the ultimate military backstop of the international order. That belief shaped oil markets, alliances, trade routes, currencies, and even fear itself. Because nations do not obey power alone. They obey the belief that power cannot be challenged. But what happens when that belief begins to crack? Not on television, not in public speeches, but inside intelligence briefings, military planning rooms, central banks, and ministries of defense. That is where real history begins. And that is why what may be happening between China and Iran matters far more than most people realize. On the surface, the story looks simple. Iran faces sanctions, pressure, threats, and economic isolation. For years, many believed that eventually the pressure alone would force Tehran to compromise. But that assumption depends entirely on one condition: isolation. And what if Iran is no longer isolated? What if the world's largest industrial power has quietly decided that Iran is no longer a liability, but a strategic asset? Before we go further, ask yourself one question. Why would China care? Why would a country whose economy depends on trade, manufacturing, exports, shipping, and technology risk deeper cooperation with one of the most sanctioned nations on earth? From Beijing's perspective, Iran is not merely a country. Iran is geography. Iran is leverage. Iran is energy. Iran is access. Iran is influence over one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. And throughout strategic history, geography has always mattered more than headlines. Look at the map carefully. Iran sits near one of the most important energy corridors in the world, a corridor through which a massive percentage of global oil passes every single day, a corridor capable of influencing fuel prices, inflation, shipping insurance, commodity markets, national budgets, and political stability thousands of miles away. Whoever influences that corridor influences far more than ships. They influence panic, timing, markets, and governments. China understands this better than almost anyone because China's rise was never built on factories alone. It was built on supply chains, and supply chains survive only when the routes feeding them remain secure. Now imagine you are a Chinese strategist. You look westward and see military alliances forming, naval pressure increasing, semiconductor restrictions tightening, financial containment expanding, and strategic encirclement slowly taking shape. At that moment, you ask yourself one critical question. If pressure continues to rise, where can we create leverage? That is where Iran enters the equation. In strategic competition, a player who feels contained does not attack the enemy's strongest position directly. Instead, he creates pressure where the opponent struggles to respond. That is how rising powers survive. That is how old systems are challenged, and that is how empires become vulnerable to surprise. But the real weapon here is not missiles, drones, or fighter jets. Those are visible weapons. Visible weapons create headlines. Invisible weapons reshape history. The real weapon may be strategic integration. If China has quietly offered Iran deeper integration into its industrial, financial, technological, and security architecture, then what Washington faces is not simply an arms transfer. It is something much harder to stop. Missiles can be intercepted, ships can be tracked, aircraft can be detected. But integrated supply chains, alternative payment systems, satellite coordination, cyber infrastructure, intelligence sharing, industrial cooperation, and secure communications networks are far more difficult to attack. And if such integration is truly happening, every military planner in the region must recalculate everything. Because suddenly Iran is no longer operating alone. Sanctions become weaker. Economic pressure loses effectiveness. Timelines change. And when timelines change, wars change. There is something most people never fully understand about conflict. Wars are rarely won by whoever possesses the strongest weapons. Wars are won by whoever can endure the longest. Who can absorb losses? Who can replace shortages? Who can sustain pressure? Who can adapt faster? Endurance decides outcomes. And that is where China becomes strategically dangerous. Because China may not need to fire a single shot. It may not need to deploy soldiers or launch bombers. All Beijing may need to do is ensure that Iran never runs out of options. Think about that carefully. Imagine a sanctioned nation suddenly gaining access to industrial components, alternative trade corridors, financial workarounds, cyber infrastructure, satellite coordination, and technological support. At that point, what exactly are sanctions accomplishing anymore? And if sanctions stop working, what happens to deterrence? If deterrence weakens, what happens to credibility? And if credibility begins eroding, what happens to empire? This is how decline begins, not through immediate defeat, but through doubt. Because once allies begin doubting, they begin hedging. And once they begin hedging, they quietly prepare for a future where old guarantees may no longer be enough. Now imagine yourself sitting inside a strategic planning room in Washington. Intelligence reports begin arriving. You notice unusual shipping routes, unexplained industrial cooperation, long-term energy contracts, secure communication systems, banking arrangements, satellite coordination, and joint logistical patterns. None of these details alone proves anything, but together they form a picture. And that picture suggests one terrifying possibility. The game may already be changing quietly, slowly, but permanently. And silent structural shifts are always the hardest to stop. History repeatedly shows the same pattern. Whenever a dominant system begins losing monopoly control, the early signs are ignored. Markets dismiss them. Politicians deny them. Media underestimates them. Experts debate them endlessly. Then suddenly everyone acts shocked when the structure finally shifts, even though the shift began years earlier. What may be happening between China and Iran right now could become one of those moments. Because if Beijing has truly decided that keeping Iran strategically alive serves China's long-term interests, then this is no longer about one country surviving pressure. This becomes a competition between entire systems. And when systems compete, everything becomes political. Currencies, ports, energy routes, banking systems, trade corridors, technology standards, and military alliances. Empires rarely collapse because they suddenly become weak. They collapse because other players quietly become connected. That is the word to remember, connected. Isolated states can be pressured. Connected states become ecosystems, and ecosystems are far more difficult to destroy. Now stop looking at Iran merely as a country. Imagine it as a node inside a larger strategic network. Energy flowing from the west, manufacturing from the east, logistics corridors from the north, alternative financial systems from the south, cyber cooperation across borders, and satellite infrastructure above everything. Then ask yourself one deeply uncomfortable question. If one node is attacked, does the system weaken or does the network respond? That question alone may be keeping some strategic planners awake at night. Because the world may be entering an era where wars are no longer decided solely by armies, but by networks, financial networks, technological networks, industrial networks, cyber networks, and logistical networks. And network competition is extraordinarily difficult to defeat because there is no single target to destroy. If China has truly offered Iran a pathway into a broader strategic network, then what we may be witnessing is not merely a political alliance. It may be the early architecture of a parallel global order. A system where sanctions create innovation, pressure creates alternatives, and isolation creates new alliances. And if that model succeeds, the next decade could look dramatically different from the last. Because history never asks permission before changing. First, it moves quietly. Then suddenly everyone realizes the board has already changed, and the smartest players were several moves ahead the entire time. So the real question is not whether China gave Iran a missile, a drone, or a radar system. The real question is this: did China help Iran become something far more dangerous, a country that no longer needs permission to endure? And if the answer is yes, then what comes next may not simply reshape the Middle East. It may reshape the logic of global power itself.